I'm Robin Farmanfarmaian, and I am extremely excited to be in this particular conference because my main stuff really talks about shifting care to the home. And so here's our agenda. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the business landscape, but I'm going to spend the bulk of the time really on the devices and the AI-based software that is making the at-home clinic a very robust clinical offering. Now, before I dive into that, I want to give you a little background on myself so you understand my point of view. I'm an early stage entrepreneur across pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and AI-based software. Currently, I'm an advisor on a number of companies, including Luxonic, which is VR for radiologists, so that they can practice off-site. And I just started a new company on generative AI and a medical scribe, if you guys want to talk to me tonight at the dinner about those. But the main reason I went into healthcare is because as a teenager, I was misdiagnosed with an autoimmune disease. All told, I've had 43 hospitalizations, 6 major surgeries, and 3 organs removed. By the time I was 26, this was 7 years after I had my entire large intestine surgically removed. It was called a total colectomy with J-pouch, which was considered a cure. But I definitely wasn't cured. And I was in pretty extreme pain. So over a period of time, my doctors just kept upping and upping my opiate dose until eventually they switched me over to 80 milligrams a day of methadone. Now that is an absolutely gigantic dose of medication, and I hated it. And so as soon as I was able to get back into my pain clinic, I was like, okay, doc, I need off this medication. I think the rebound pain is worse than the actual pain. And she said, okay, well, next step could be to think about surgically implanting a morphine pump into your spine. I was like, are you kidding? I was 26 years old. I was essentially a shut-in. I could barely function on a daily basis. And what I was hearing was that was the rest of my life. And so I said, absolutely not. And I decided to become the CEO of my own healthcare team. Went home that night and I dropped my own methadone dose by about 40%, which I would never recommend anybody do. Spent about a week, crawling from the bedroom to the kitchen just to get lemonade and salt. But then I felt better. And I rebuilt my care team with doctors that worked with me as a team and a colleague. I ended up getting diagnosed correctly with Crohn's, put on an IV med called Remicade. And within 24 hours of that very first dose, I went into full remission. It quite literally happened overnight. Now that I've shocked everyone, take a deep breath. Let's talk about now what's going on shifting care into the home and the AI component that really makes it that robust clinic. In fact, everyone in this room, we understand this, right? Location is probably the biggest barrier to care because it leads to so many follow-on problems like mobility issues, transportation, vicinity, right? Can someone take a day off of work? Once you solve for location, all of a sudden, all of those follow-on problems disappear. And so, there we go. Now, I talk about the private payers a lot, but this even came as a surprise to me. These 6 largest private payers now are taking almost 30% of all revenue on the healthcare industry in the US. That is a giant amount. And so looking at just these 3, Humana, CVS, Aetna, and United, collectively, they have spent over $40 billion in the past few years buying up giant companies that either provide primary care or care at home, specifically around value-based healthcare. Raise hands, anyone here from Amedisys or LHC or Landmark? Okay, so those are 3 of the giants that United bought. United also now has employed or contracts with over 90,000 physicians, making them the largest employer for physicians in the United States. Looking at CVS Aetna, same exact kind of moves. They bought Signify Health, which provides those in-home health assessments. And Humana, of course, bought Kindred at Home. They divested themselves from the hospice, which was about a $2.2 billion standalone company at this point. But we are seeing they are spending a huge amount of money. And not just buying up companies, but they're making huge investments as well into things like Monogram Health, which provides polychronic care centered around kidney care. Now raise your hands, how many people saw this come out last month? Okay, so the FDA now has a big home as a healthcare hub initiative out there. Specifically, they're going to start focusing on diabetes in low-income areas, But of course, that can expand dramatically. Now, if you were to Google this and you see some of the news that came out around this, it says in big letters in the titles, VR and the FDA and the home. Okay, so they have hired an architectural firm to create a VR model of what a successful healthcare at home platform will look like. So it's not about VR in the home, it's just going to show the examples. All right, so let's talk about some of the devices and the software that are really shifting care to the home. And so raise your hands, how many people use remote patient monitoring devices? Okay, awesome. So the one on the left, that's the Vital Connect. It's a single lead EKG. They can predict with 80% accuracy a hospital readmission with over 6 days advance notice. BioIntelliSense in the upper corner, that also is a single lead EKG. They are taking 1,400 measurements every day on every patient. But the BioBeat, this is specifically for acute care in the home. And what it's using is something called PPG technology. That stands for photoplasmography. Oh, and by the way, the correct spelling will be on the final exam. But PPG technology was commercialized in the 1980s, and it's the way pulse oximeters have always worked. But because they use PPG technology, they are able to continuously monitor 13 different vital signs, which ends up being millions of data points every day on every patient. You can see over the next 10 years, we're going to be creating a lot more clinical grade data in the patient's home than is locked up right now in the electronic medical records. Now, raise your hands, how many people have been playing around with generative AI and the large language models? Okay, has everyone here at least played with ChatGPT? Okay, the ones who have not, absolutely, you need to understand this generative AI component. And I can talk to you at the dinner about it and how that can actually impact your business. But they partnered up with Cerebrus, which is one of the LLM type services. And it turns out there's a signal in someone's EKG that can predict atrial fibrillation 2 to 3 months in advance. And so Mayo Clinic used an algorithm and deployed it across 400,000 patients. And those patients, they did see that signal in their single lead EKG, immediately got a step up in care to remote patient monitoring. Now, raise your hands, anyone seen ADAR Health yet? Okay, so this is so cool. The other ones are based on old technology. This is new. This cleared the FDA a little over 2 years ago, and it is this handheld device called their mouth lab. Patient blows into it, it's also taking saliva, and it's taking some readings off the patient's hand. So in under 60 seconds, it's able to take these 10 clinical grade vital signs. How easy is that for a patient or a caregiver to use in the home? Now, this is an interesting company as well. This is Casper AI, and it is a sensor that goes on the wall, which means the patient does not need to do anything, they don't need to remember anything, they don't need to have anything on their body. It's using radar, so no video, no audio, and they're able to determine or detect micro and macro movements. Because they are able to do that with radar-based technology, they can get continuous heart rate and respiratory rate for that longitudinal data over time. Because we're so used to measuring vital signs episodically, right? You know, you take your blood pressure maybe 3 times a day. All of a sudden, with this longitudinal data, we can start to pick up things that episodic care never would pick up. Raise your hands, how many people have heard of TytoCare? Okay, what about MetaWand? Okay, so both TytoCare and MetaWand, they have cleared the FDA. What this is a telemedicine toolkit. It is a video camera that fits onto an otoscope, a stethoscope, and a tongue depressor. Now, imagine I have an earache, or my mom was a pediatrician, so I grew up and there were always neighborhood kids in the kitchen with my mom looking into their ears, like every single day. And so imagine, you know, you have a screaming toddler with an earache. Well, instead of going to urgent care or primary care, you call a doctor over video through the app. The doctor walks you through using these clinical grade devices on yourself or say on someone next to you. And because it's on a video camera, the doctor can actually tap into that live video camera feed. So if I have the otoscope in my ear, my doctor can say, hey, Robin, move it a little bit to the left or move it a little bit to the right so she can have a clear view. This can also be done asynchronously. So if you have a caregiver at home, they can do a stethoscope, they can do the tongue depressor, and actually take a video recording and send it to a doctor later on so the doctor can read it. And in fact, they cleared the FDA 2 years ago with an AI-based lung sounds analyzer to detect things like wheezing. Now, we're seeing a lot of sensors going onto existing medical devices. All 3 of these companies have cleared the FDA, and they just fit onto any existing inhaler. It's tracking when, where, how often, and how much medication a patient is using. And companies like Nuvo Air, they also have a coaching component that's AI-based for things like COPD, because as we know in this room, right, COPD is incredibly difficult for people to manage. So having that AI-based, essentially coach hold their hands. And by the way, you can download all of the back data on this into something that you can print out, so you can bring it in to your doctor if needed, or in case someone needs to send a fax. Now, just looking at adding a basic sensor and a basic digital app. Look at these numbers. An almost 60% increase in medication adherence and almost 80% reduction in the use of a rescue inhaler. It's a pretty big deal. And so I want to say, everyone in this room, you guys are like literally on the cutting edge right now, and these kinds of companies are being acquired. ResMed acquired Propeller a few years ago for $225 million. Now, raise your hands, how many people know someone with diabetes? Yes, okay. So it's a pretty big deal to be able to avoid having a skin ulcer on the bottom of your foot. This is a company called Siren Care. Cleared the FDA. They are socks that are available by prescription only. Now, it turns out you have to measure the temperature of the bottom of someone's foot before it actually breaks through the skin and becomes a skin ulcer. This is a big deal because 30% of patients with diabetes end up getting skin ulcers, and of that, 10% end up resulting in a lower limb amputation, which every time I say that on stage, it just literally breaks my heart, like gives me chills. So a simple pair of socks that can be thrown in the washer and dryer. It's on a subscription model like all the rest of the RPM devices are, but you can actually prevent someone from losing their limbs. Now, this is really cool. We're starting to see movement as a vital sign. And so there are 3 apps that have already cleared the FDA that metricize Parkinson's disease involuntary body movements and spasms. 2 are for the Apple Watch, and there's 1 on the market already for the Garmin watch. They tap into the accelerometer and the gyroscope, and they metricize these movements. Fantastic to really, see the disease trajectory over time, but it also gives the doctor deep data when they're adjusting medications on medication timing and things like dosage. All right, so raise your hands. How many people have a baseline on their own cholesterol? You guys, okay. Raise your hands. How many people have a baseline on their blood pressure? You guys know what your blood pressure is? Okay. Raise your hands. How many people have a baseline on their brain health? Yeah, I asked that question a lot, and the only time there were about 30 or 40 hands went up, it was a neurology conference. But really, they're the only ones that actually did that. So it turns out 40% of dementia is preventable, and in some cases, even reversible at the early stages. But the problem is that most of us don't go to see a neurologist until our memory is impacting our daily lives. And if someone's memory is already impacting their daily life, it is typically too far advanced for a pharmaceutical intervention or lifestyle behavior modification to make a big difference in the disease trajectory. Well, this is a company called BrainCheck, and there are about 3 of these, I think, on the market already. What they've done is they've taken those standard neurological exams that you have in a neuro clinic, but they've gamified them and they've electronified them. And they've taken the provider out of the equation, so people don't actually have to sit there with a clinician anymore. They're distributing, instead of through the 10 to 15,000 neurologists that we have in any given year, instead they are distributing through the over 250,000 primary care doctors that we have. And so you can do this in primary care in the home. You can do it just normal home health care. You can do it in the primary care clinic. All you need to do is you hand the patient a smart tablet. Or if they're in the home, you just literally send them the link to the app. And they're able to, in about 10 minutes, get that cognitive assessment done. Now, this is reimbursed under fee-for-service for both the cognitive assessment, but also a care platform. Under value-based healthcare, this is reimbursed at over $4,200. All right, so if you have movement as a vital sign, what about the voice as a vital sign? We're seeing a whole new category called vocal biomarkers, literally using someone's voice as a vital sign. And so the easiest application of this is the ability to count the number of times someone coughs. Think about that for a second. None of us have ever written down how many times a day that we cough, but that is the single biggest driver for primary care, and it is a pretty giant driver for urgent care. We've never had the data before now. Well, there are at least 15 companies already on the market that I'm aware of. This is a company called HCIF. What they're doing is not only counting coughs, but they're able to categorize coughs into things like a whooping or a wheezing or a productive cough, because the way a cough sounds is both an indication of the problem, but of what particular treatment will work for that particular patient. There's another company that's already on the market. Now, while HCIF, the one I just mentioned, uses any microphone, Stratos actually has a microphone that you put onto the patient's skin, and it sticks there. And they're able to do things like frequency, bouts, and spasms. Now, it turns out there are over 2 million ER visits and hospitalizations every year for COPD. Well, it turns out just monitoring the number of times someone coughs and the time of day that they are coughing, they're able to predict a COPD exacerbation with over 3 days advance notice before a patient would actually go to urgent care. All right, so this is a very cool company, and they're based here in San Francisco. And so it's called Ellipsis. And what they're being used for is in the actual clinic visit, whether that's in a brick and mortar, whether that's in home healthcare, or whether that's telemedicine. And they are able to clinically measure and identify things like depression, anxiety, and stress. So you can metricize those. And by the way, it takes the place of the verbal PHQ-8, which is the patient health questionnaire for mental health status. Cambridge Cognition is really cool. They recently, or a couple of years ago, I want to say, acquired a company called Winterlight Labs. And they now already are working on over 250 different indications. Now, they're able to detect with a 60-second voice test, 100% accuracy for aphasia and 82% accuracy for Alzheimer's disease. 60-second voice test. Now, Sond is one of the oldest in the space. They're a very cool company. Early on, they identified 4,000 unique features to the human voice. Now, this is an app made by Together by Renee. Raise your hands, how many people remember HEAL, the primary care in the home? Okay, so this is the same founding team for Together by Renee, partnered up with Sond. And so this is a free app you can download. It's not gone through the FDA, so this is direct to consumer, for entertainment purposes only. But what it will do is measure these 8 parameters and give you a mental health fitness score on a daily basis. Now, the other interesting thing that Together by Renee is doing is they are using a smartphone camera to detect blood pressure and things like heart rate variability. Now, this has not been cleared by the FDA. Most of the things I'm talking about today have been cleared. This has not. This is direct to consumer. But you can imagine a scenario where you've got a patient who's very remote, and they don't have access to a blood pressure monitor, and they don't have in-home help. So pulling up your smartphone camera and getting your blood pressure that way is better than not taking it at all. And in fact, I have had a nurse in my home where she'll do the standard cuff and the stethoscope to take my blood pressure, and then I'll use one of the many companies that are working on it through the smartphone, and it's accurate, right? They just have not done the clinical trials needed specifically for FDA clearance. Now, raise your hands, how many people have heard of the LEQ by Intuition Robotics? Couple, okay, so this is a very cool. It's a social robot. It comes with a smart speaker, tablet, and video camera, and it's specifically for aging in place. It can do things like remote monitoring, medication reminders, it can tell jokes. Grandma can say, hey, LEQ, call my son, or hey, LEQ, call my doctor. But the thing is, it's based in machine learning, and they've already plugged into GPT-4. So it learns about the patient over time. And so if LEQ notices that grandma walks past her every day at 9 a.m. to go get a cup of tea, and if grandma doesn't show up one day, LEQ is going to get worried. She's going to ping grandma, and if there's no response, she will ping the pre-programmed care team. All right, so this one is scary cool. It's a company called Be My Eyes, and they launched in 2017, and it's for patients who are blind or who have low vision. And what they did is they recruited thousands and thousands of volunteers all over the world, and so when someone is blind, they can just turn on their video camera, and one of the volunteers will literally tell everything that the blind person is in front of them, and so that they're literally being their eyes. Well, when GPT launched, they immediately used that to replace a lot of the volunteers. And so imagine I'm standing in front of my refrigerator, hold the app open with GPT, and it's able to say, okay, hey, Robin, you know, the milk is in the upper left-hand corner, and it's expiring on May 30th. And your butter is in the lower right corner, and there's some asparagus right in front of you. Because it's based in generative AI, this is so scary. What happens is they will automatically suggest a number of recipes that can be used with that food. Now, I'll take you through the fact that they understand this context. You have to understand that the refrigerator holds food that human beings need to take out and prepare and then eat. That wasn't programmed. This is because it is plugged into that large language model. So McKinsey came out with a study, and according to them, this year and next year is going to have over $265 billion worth of healthcare services shift into the home. And so looking at dialysis at home, I mean, we know that two companies really dominate the dialysis space, DaVita, which is now owned by United Healthcare, and Fresenius. But Humana and Medicare started making a big push for dialysis in the home a couple of years before the pandemic, which means there's now new opportunities, right? And so you see the big device on the screen. That's the Utset, and it is a beautiful, self-contained, full dialysis machine that you can have. Companies can own them, bring them into the patient's home, and do dialysis there. Now, if a patient has their own dialysis machine or has access to using dialysis on a daily basis, we are seeing that they are surviving 3 times longer than patients who go into a dialysis clinic. That is equivalent to a kidney transplant. Now, the reason is because, of course, our kidneys don't work only 3 times a week for 3 hours each day, right? And so if someone has it at home with them, they can do it overnight while they're eating breakfast. They can do it multiple times every single day if they'd like. And this means patients can also travel if they have a small dialysis machine, which they've never been able to do before, because you try and go away from your dialysis clinic for more than 3 days, and you quite literally would end up dying. Now, this is my living room, where I get the vast majority of my healthcare in my apartment now, or within a 3-block radius. Here I'm getting my Remicade. I've been on it now for over 20 years. Please do not try and do the math. First 15 years, I got it done in the normal hospital infusion clinics. Now, I get this every 6 weeks, which means I get it 8 times a year. And while I love my GI doctor and I love all of my providers, the infusion clinic and hospitals are pretty hardcore. I'd walk in and it would be one giant room with 16 patients, all on IVs, no windows, constant noise, and when you've got 16 patients on IV meds, there is always a high-pitched alarm bell going off the entire time. And so I'd be there for 3 or 4 hours, and I'd go home and I would be shaking, and every single cell in my body hurt. Well, I work sometimes in early-stage pharmaceuticals. I'm on the business side, I'm not on the science side, but I do understand some of the basics. This is the first of the biologics, it's an anti-TNF alpha drug. Because it's a biologic, it has both protein in it, but being number 1, it also still has mouse protein in it. And so in my head, it made sense that I didn't feel well. It was just the price to pay to like actually get a medication that puts my Crohn's into remission. And it would take me a pretty hardcore 7 days to recover, which comes out to about 2 months a year that I was recovering from Remicade. Well, about 7 years ago, my insurance policy, and this happened across multiple different insurance companies, said, okay, well, Robin, you want to stay on Remicade, you're going to have to get it done in the home or an alternate site infusion clinic. I was like, you're just telling me this now. I would have been doing it in the home the entire time. This is not something that doctors tell their patients. So I use Option Care. Option Care used to be Walgreens. It's now owned by private equity, and they're able to reach about 90% of the US. What they do is they send the medication to me on ice through FedEx. I throw it in my refrigerator, and then my nurse comes the next week. And by the way, I can text with her back and forth to make the appointment, which is how patients want to communicate to begin with, right? And so she comes in, mixes the medication on site, draws labs, and then just drops them off at the nearest LabCorp or Quest. My recovery time went from a pretty hardcore 7 days and 2 months a year to a mild to completely non-existent 0, maybe 1 day, just by changing the patient's environment. I was not reacting to the medication, I was reacting to the environment. Now, of course, my insurance company wasn't thinking this. This isn't something that in pharmaceuticals you really start to think about, right, during clinical trials and things like that. They did it because of cost. Turns out my hospital was charging $28,000 just for the medication. Option Care charges $2,500. Over a 5-year period, that comes out to a difference in billing of over $1 million. My copay went from $8,000 a year to under $1,000 a year, which means in 7 years, I've saved about $50,000, right? And this is a medication that a lot of us are on for life. Now, GetLabs is a pretty cool company. Raise your hands, has anyone heard of GetLabs yet? Okay, a couple people. So what they are is they come to your home or your business. This is out of pocket, $35 to $100, and I think they're pretty much across the country now. You need lab orders from your provider, and those are fully covered under your normal insurance. So the labs are covered. It's just them coming to your house right now that is not covered. And so they can draw labs and drop them off at the nearest LabCorp or Quest. They can do things like retinal scans, bone density scans, and even mobile imaging. Now, raise your hands, how many people have the capabilities of doing infusions for their patients? Any couple? Okay. Well, Cencora used to be called AmerisourceBergen. In order to stay very competitive with the other two giants, McKesson and Cardinal Health, they have launched essentially infusion as a service for home healthcare companies and hospitals and health systems. And so what they will do is they've partnered up with WeInfuse, which is that beautiful software that takes care of all of the infusion things, from the payer to the billing to the deductible and all of that. And so what they will do is they set this up for you to bring infusions into the home, and then the company can make $5,000 to $8,000 on average, per infusion. So this is something that everyone in this room could potentially partner with, and Cencora will just manage it for you. Now, I normally talk about Dispatch Health. I knew Kevin was speaking before me, so I just wanted to say, woo, woo, like big shout out, because he's the right time at the right place. One thing Kevin did not mention is that 3 giants, United, Humana, and Blue Shield of California, are 3 of their investors. When 3 giants like that all put money into the same company, I definitely like to pay attention. New York Presbyterian now has a mobile stroke treatment unit because we know seconds and minutes count in the world of strokes. And so they're able to come to someone's home with things like a portable CT scanner. Why that's so interesting is because there's a company called Viz AI. It's both in cardiac as well as neuro. And this is the AI-based software that automatically will look at the images. And so this was the first company that actually qualified for Medicare's new technology add-on payment of about $1,400. Now, they have graduated from the new technology add-on payment into their own code, and they are being reimbursed at about $1,360 or so. But what it will do, it will immediately analyze the imaging autonomously, right? Does not need a provider of any kind to actually interpret the results, and it will give a binary answer. Yes or no, right? You're finding an LVO stroke. And with things like LVO strokes, large vessel occlusion strokes, these are some of the most damaging type of strokes. And what you want to do is get a patient into a surgical procedure called a thrombectomy as fast as possible. So this is the kind of thing that can save lives. And they are working with New York Presbyterian. Now, raise your hands, how many people have realized about or learned about this code that came out 2.5 years ago? Okay, so the AMA launched a new CPT code for autonomous AI in a reimbursable primary care setting, which means the home absolutely qualifies for this. And so this is another one of those autonomous software that does not require any type of clinician to interpret the results. This is specifically looking for diabetic retinopathy. And so it turns out about 60,000 people with diabetes lose their sight every year from diabetic retinopathy, and that is absolutely avoidable. But the problem is it's so difficult to make an appointment with an ophthalmologist. In fact, mine was booking out, and I just wanted to do my annual test. Mine books out like 4 months in advance, and it's literally torture to try and make an appointment with them. And so I gave up with ophthalmology, and I started going to an optometrist instead. Well, this is very cool because all you need is a retinal camera, or what's also called a fundus camera. And there are retinal cameras now that actually attach to a smartphone. And so what you can do is in a primary care setting or in the home, you can use that retinal scanner to get the photos. And then digital diagnostics, in under 60 seconds, again, will analyze the images and give that binary answer. Yes, the patient has diabetic retinopathy, or no, the patient is good to go. Come back next year and get checked. All right, so this is the only company that's in my presentation. I'm actually on the advisory board of that, which means I get a very small number of stock options that vest over a long period of time. But this is a device that does portable ultrasound, and it's autonomous as well. So the thing is, with breast cancer detection, there are millions of women who do not have access right now to a mammogram. And a mammogram machine can cost upwards of $500,000. Well, what this does is it's a device that is so small I can fit it in my normal purse, right? It can be used in the field. And the thing with ultrasound is that it's typically only as good as the clinician performing the ultrasound. But because we've replaced the clinician with AI, it does a 2-minute automated scan of each breast. That is all they need. So this can be done not only in rural communities, but I went to the CEO's house a few months ago and just did my breast cancer screening while on her couch drinking wine. Now this one's really cool. Raise your hands, how many people know someone or have the capabilities to do physical therapy? Okay, so you see around the woman's leg, that's a sensor. It can wrap around the leg, it wraps around the arm, head, torso, shoulders, and what it's able to do is objectively measure physical therapy progress over time. And it turns out 70% of patients drop out of physical therapy purely because they do not know if they are seeing any progress or not. It's too hard for them to determine if they're getting better. Well, this will objectively measure, and so you can tell the patient, hey, yes, look at the graphs. Your functional mobility or your range of motion is incredibly, better than it was even like 3 weeks ago or what have you. But it turns out you can reduce attrition by 20%, meaning keeping those 20% of patients in physical therapy can actually increase revenue by 1%. So for companies that are doing physical therapy, this is a pretty big deal. All right, so you're probably thinking, there are so many devices and so many software programs. Do patients need to sign in to 15 or 20 different apps? How do you get this data to the provider? Well, this is a massive opportunity space. There's a lot of companies really wanting to be that data platform that can aggregate wearable tech data, integrate that, do the predictive analytics, and then talk back and forth to the electronic medical record. And so Current Health is one of the interesting ones in this space. Raise your hands, how many people have heard of Current Health? Okay, so it's one of those, one of the data platforms, but the big deal is Best Buy, you know, the consumer electronics giant, 2.5 years ago, spent $400 million to buy Current Health, which means overnight with one giant check, Best Buy is now a hospital provider. Pretty mind-blowing. Oh, but my favorite part of them is that they actually send their geek squad into patients' homes to set up the remote patient monitoring. Now, Bioformis is another interesting company in this space. They brought me in to do a keynote at a conference that they had last year, so I was able to talk to a lot of the nurses that were there. And so they told me some great stories, but one of the big ones is that not only can they do the hospitalization and the remote monitoring at home with the predictive analytics and catch things, but they can do things like clinical trials in the home. This is a really big deal because it turns out 85% of clinical trials are significantly delayed due to a lack of patient enrollment. And that's a big deal because it turns out once a pharmaceutical company has picked a geographic location for their clinical trial, they're limited to the patient pool that lives in that vicinity. In fact, my sister-in-law had 13 brain metastases, and she was in a clinical trial, and she lived right outside of a major city, surrounded by healthcare and great healthcare, but the clinical trial was going on in a state next door. And so she had to, every Monday morning, drive 5 hours round trip just for a blood draw. Let me tell you, that absolutely had an impact on her health. And so by using companies like Current Health or Bioformis, you can do those clinical trials in the home. And in fact, Bioformis has partnered up with the Mayo Clinic, and they already have monitored over 23,000 patients. And look at those numbers. Almost 50% reduction in ICU admissions and reductions in hospital days. Like, those are giant numbers. But thinking about one of the stories they told me, they had a 78-year-old guy who they were doing remote monitoring on, and as part of their program, they were calling him every 2 to 3 days, the nurses at Bioformis. And he was, you know, boisterous, and he loved flirting with the nurses, and he looked forward to the calls, and he was super high energy. And then the nurses started to notice that his heart rate dropped a little bit. Not something a normal patient would notice, right, unless we were taking our heart rate continuously. And they got worried, and so they called him, and he was tired, and he wasn't his normal self, and he did no flirting, and they knew him at that point. And so they got worried, and they adjusted his beta blockers, and it worked for a short period of time, but they started to see his heart rate dropping a little bit, and he was back to being really tired. And so they said, okay, you need to go see your clinician now. We need you to get seen immediately. Turns out he needed a pacemaker. Way patients like that typically find out that they need a pacemaker. They stand up, they get dizzy, fall to the ground, break a hip, and as we know, at that age, that is a catastrophic injury. So by just monitoring their heart rate, they were able to avoid that with him. All right, so here are your takeaways. I am telling you, everyone in this room, you are at the right place at the right time. We're seeing massive acquisitions, a massive shift into the home. CMS is behind a lot of it. FDA now is behind a lot of it. And the hospitals are realizing that they also like to do that in the home. Right time and right place. Like, this is amazing. Secondly, longitudinal data. Data over time versus, you know, the sporadic, episodic data that we're able to collect really can show a lot more. And lastly, technology is really shifting the way patients interact with healthcare. Now that we're using Apple Watches to track our single lead EKGs, and we're using beautiful devices like TytoCare, we no longer are going to tolerate, you know, 1980s style devices. And so this is changing the way patients like to interact with their healthcare. And with that, I will say thank you.
Let's give it up for Robin.